Okay, there is a speech or a talk by a professor Eugene Kontorovich, making the legal case for the creation of Israel. Um, Now, I want to make a case against the legal legitimacy of the creation of Israel. I'm not contesting or disputing the right of Israel to exist now, but I am going to make a case that when it was initially created, there was no legal case for it to be created. Um, Now, the first argument or the first claim that Professor Kontrovich makes is that Palestine belonged to the Ottoman Empire from 1516 to 1917. He says that, quote, nobody argued that there was any problem with Ottoman sovereignty until 1917. Everyone agrees that it belonged to the Ottoman Turks, end of quote. No, everyone does not agree. Most importantly, international law as it exists now does not agree with an empire controlling anyone's land. Imperial claims are not considered legitimate under international law. The driving principle behind international law, or I should say the guiding principle of international law, is self-determination. The people who were sovereign, or the people who had sovereignty, legitimate sovereignty, were the people who were native or indigenous to the land, which in this case would be the native Palestinians, approximately 90% of whom were Muslim, 5% were Christian, 4 to 5% were Jewish. The native Palestinians. No one else had a legal right of sovereignty to that land. The next claim that Professor Kontrovich makes is that Palestine was promised to the Jews as a Jewish homeland at a big international conference called San Remo. He says, quote, this was not a colonialist thing. Every country was there, end of quote. No, Professor Kontrovich, every country was not there. The Conference of San Remo in 1920 was signed by four countries. The agreement was signed by four countries: the United Kingdom, France, Imperial Japan, and Italy. All four of these countries at the time were empires. They all had offshore colonies. These colonies and empires were eventually all dismantled. Under modern international law, they had no right to divvy up their spoils of empire in a colonialist imperial agreement that has absolutely no legitimacy under modern international law. So when Professor Kontrovich, who purports to be an authority on international law and someone who knows the history of the region and is in a position to make a legal case for Israel, makes a claim that every country was at this conference and it was not a colonialist thing, when in fact it was an agreement or a conference attended by exactly four countries, all four of which were massive empires, that completely shoots his credibility down. It shows that he's not even trying to be accurate with his statements and his claims, and he's blatantly deceiving people with this. He's spreading misinformation. The next argument that Professor Kontorovich makes is that the British Mandate document, that declaration that has promised Jews a homeland in Palestine, it promised all of Palestine for Jewish homeland. He says that Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and all of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan was promised as a Jewish homeland. Um, he quotes the actual document, the British Mandate, to support his claim, and the excerpt from the document says, the mandatory power should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration ... in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, end of quote. Now, in that excerpt that I just recited, it's important to note that there is no mention of a state in Palestine for Jews. What it says is that a Jewish quote-unquote national home should be established in Palestine. None of the signatories to this declaration interpret that to mean that all of Palestine was going to become a Jewish state. They all believe that it meant that in that territory, within Palestine, there would be a Jewish homeland. That's how all the partition plans interpreted the document, including all the partition plans created by the United Kingdom, which was the power that created that declaration. Now, the next claim that Professor Kontorovich makes is that the League of Nations, which ratified the San Remo Agreement, had, quote, the authority to make binding international decisions. All of the countries agreed to this, quote unquote. And, quote, this body was created by all the countries, unquote. Now, the League of Nations was not created by all of the countries, and all of the countries did not agree to this. The United Nations, the United States, the most powerful country in the world in terms of economic influence and power at the time, was not even a member of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was famously powerless and lacked international legitimacy. In fact, most modern nations that exist today were colonies of League of Nations member states when the League of Nations existed. So most of today's countries, in fact most of the world's population today, is not represented by the member states of the League of Nations, because most of them were populations of colonial territories and had no representation in the imperial power that had representation and controlled them. Finally, Professor Kontorovich makes the claim that since all of the modern Middle Eastern nations have their borders pretty much what they were by pretty much the way that they were established by the mandates of the League of Nations, that creates international legitimacy for the League of Nations mandates. For example, the British mandate for Palestine. Now, what's important to note here is that the reason why modern Middle Eastern states have the borders they do is not because the League of Nations had some kind of legitimacy or was, has its agreements are binding under international law. The reason is because that's just the way it's been. Precedence creates legal authority or legal legitimacy. Many of the nations that exist in Americas, like Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, they were not created in a internationally legally acceptable way. They were created through empire and colony. But we still maintain those borders as they were created in that illegitimate manner. We maintain them because a precedence has been created. After some time, a nation acquires precedence, even if it was created in an illegitimate fashion. Right? This is the same principle here. The Middle Eastern states, the borders as they exist now are the borders that were established by League of Nations mandates. But it's not the legitimacy of the League of Nations that makes those borders legitimate. It's the time that those borders have existed that has created precedence, which creates authority under international law. That's the only reason. Equating the argument that since the modern borders are the same as the borders created by the League of Nations, that means that the League of Nations has international authority and is legitimate under international law, is the same as claiming colonial empires from 300 years ago are legitimate under international law, since the borders they created at that time are the same borders we use today. That's an invalid argument